I've been working at Chuck E. Cheese for quite some time now, and since I often work the closing shift, I've had my fair share of unsettling moments. But one night, things took a turn that I'll never forget. It was just me and two of my coworkers, both female, closing up the place. It was late, and as usual, the lights were dim, the games were all powered down, and the space felt oddly quiet, like it always does right before closing. We can't lock the doors until the exact minute we close, so even though we were wrapping things up, technically we were still open. That's when three men suddenly walked in. From the moment they stepped inside, something felt off. I was up front by myself at the cashier's station, and as they entered, I greeted them, trying to stay professional. But they completely ignored me. They didn't even glance my way. Instead, they pulled up their hoods, and without saying a word, walked straight toward the back, heading for the bathrooms. A strange chill crept up my spine, and I knew I had to alert someone. I quickly walked back to the office where my manager was and explained what was happening. Without hesitation, she began monitoring the cameras, keeping a close eye on them. I returned to the front, trying to stay calm, but the atmosphere felt heavier, darker, like something bad was about to happen. That's when I noticed one of the men step outside, but instead of leaving, he stood right in front of the door, as if he was blocking it. Another one of them was now at the counter, standing so still, staring down at the floor, his hood completely hiding his face. I tried breaking the silence, asking if I could help him with something, anything, but he just stood there, silent. The tension was thick, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, out of nowhere, my coworker from the kitchen came up to join me at the front. She must have sensed something was off too. We exchanged uneasy glances, both of us trying to act normal, but it was hard to ignore the strange behavior of these men. Just then, our manager came rushing up from the office, her face tense. "You need to leave," she told the man at the counter, her voice firm. "We're calling the police." At that moment, everything clicked. The guy standing in front of the door was there to distract us. My manager had been watching the cameras and saw something we hadn't. A third man, the one who had disappeared into the bathroom, had actually slipped into the kitchen. He had been standing there, staring directly at one of the security cameras, his face hidden by his hood, as if trying to intimidate whoever was watching. As soon as my manager confronted them, the tension snapped. All three men suddenly turned and bolted out of the building, sprinting toward their car. They sped off before we could get a good look at the license plate, but we were shaken. We immediately locked the doors, trying to process what had just happened. The next night, the same crew and I were closing again. We were still on edge from the night before, but things seemed calm until the employee doorbell rang. We weren't expecting anyone, so we went to check. When we looked through the door's small window, our hearts dropped. It was one of the men from the night before. He was dressed in all black this time, hood up, a ski mask covering his face, and a black backpack slung over his shoulder. Without hesitating, we immediately locked all the doors and called the police. Every second felt like an eternity as we waited for them to arrive. I kept glancing toward the door, half expecting him to try and break in. But thankfully, before anything could escalate further, the police arrived. As soon as he saw them, he ran off, disappearing into the night. I still think about that night sometimes, how quickly things could have gone wrong, and how lucky we were to have reacted in time. It was one of the most unnerving experiences I've ever had. I was working the night shift as a forklift driver at a large DIY store with a couple of adjoining warehouses. Part of my job involved unloading delivery trucks and storing materials in the allocated warehouse spaces. One night, we were running out of room, and my supervisor asked me to check if the adjoining warehouse was set up to handle any overflow. Rather than walking over, I drove the forklift to the next building. It was faster, and the night had already been long. The warehouse was huge and eerily empty. As I drove inside, everything seemed normal, until the forklift came to a sudden stop. No warning, no gradual power down, nothing. It was as if someone had hit an off switch. The engine died, the electronics cut out, and even the headlights flickered off, leaving me in total darkness. I sat there, stunned, nervously waiting for my eyes to adjust. I tried the ignition a few times, but it was completely dead. The silence in the building was suffocating, and I was the only one around, or so I thought. As my eyes slowly adapted to the dark, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Across the large, open space of the warehouse, I could make out what looked like human figures, shadowy shapes, moving silently at the far end of the building. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it, but the figures seemed real. They were far from the main building, and I knew there was no way these could be my coworkers playing some kind of prank. No one would have made it down here that quickly without me noticing. I kept fiddling with the key, but the forklift wouldn't start. My heart was pounding, and as I stared into the dark, the shape started moving toward me, slowly, deliberately. At first I thought maybe they were thieves, but there was nothing in the building worth stealing, just an empty warehouse. Then, a darker thought crept into my mind. Maybe they were junkies looking for a secluded spot to shoot up. Either way, the situation was unsettling. I kept turning the key more desperately, telling myself that if those figures got too close, if they reached a certain point, I'd abandon the forklift and make a run for it. I just claimed the forklift had broken down, and not that I'd freaked out over some creepy shapes in the dark. Just as I was about to make my move, the forklift suddenly roared back to life. The headlights flickered on, illuminating the empty warehouse. I looked around, expecting to see the figures close by, but nothing. No movement. No people. The place was as deserted as it had been when I entered. I sat there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. I could have sworn I'd seen at least 2 or 3 figures approaching me, getting within 20 meters of the forklift, but there was no one. Not a soul. Still feeling uneasy, I drove out of the warehouse, locked up, and headed back to the main building. As I reflected on it later, I couldn't help but wonder how the mind can play tricks on you, especially in the dark when you're alone. But even now, part of me isn't entirely convinced it was just my imagination. I have a side job as a security guard where I do a night shift once a week. Once a month, we have a meeting with the other guards. The job itself is at a school with around 100 students, a 2-story building with a patio. Pretty straightforward. On this particular night, we had our meeting just before my shift started. It was the usual stuff, checking the cameras, going over any incidents, sharing a few jokes. As everyone was leaving, a piece of the office ceiling randomly fell. It was strange, but nothing too out of the ordinary. I managed to put it back in place when my shift started and carried on as usual. After the others left, the building fell silent. That's when I noticed something else. The MEMP3 player we always keep on was off. Now, a bit of context. One of my colleagues has this quirky habit. He believes in some kind of feng shui principle where classical music should always be playing in the office. None of us touch it. It's his thing. But the weird part is, it's always on. Tonight, though, it wasn't. I went to investigate and turned it back on, but since I'd already turned off most of the lights, it was hard to tell if the player's display was working. I leaned in to get a better look when suddenly, out of nowhere, the damn thing blasted Wagner at full volume. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I literally jumped like a cat, heart pounding. It was one of those moments where you just stop and think, it's going to be one of those nights, isn't it? After calming myself down, I sat back in the office, reviewing the camera feeds. The street outside was winding down for the night. The neighborhood's a bit bohemian, with a bar next door, so things get lively but quiet down late. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I brushed it off, though, and went back to my usual routine: coffee, camera checks, reading a bit, just passing the time. 2 a.m. Time for my round. The building was pitch black, and I'm supposed to leave it that way during my patrols. So I step out of the office and start walking through the hallways. The school is old, so creaks and groans from the building are normal, but tonight the creaking felt different. It wasn't coming from the floors or the ceiling. It felt like it was coming from right next to me, or worse, from behind me. Every step I took, the creaking followed, right near my ear. The feeling that something or someone was behind me grew stronger with each step. I kept glancing back, but there was only darkness. The creaks followed me through the hall, through the classrooms, all the way to the stairwell leading to the first floor. At the top of the stairs, the creaking stopped, but the feeling didn't. I could still sense it lingering just out of sight as I made my way across the patio and toward the door leading back into the building. Then, the creaking started again, quiet, subtle, but undeniably close. As I walked through the patio, I caught a whiff of something foul, like something was rotting. I searched around, checked the trash cans, but nothing was there. The cafeteria had the same smell, though fainter, and once again, there was no obvious source. No food, no bugs, just the smell, lingering. I made my way to the back workshop. Suddenly, I heard a loud clang from the darkness. I swung my flashlight toward the sound and saw some scrap metal had fallen to the floor. But there was no reason it should have moved. Nothing had been disturbed. By now, I was more than just nervous. I was angry. Whatever was messing with me, I was ready to face it. My pulse was racing, but I kept breathing, forcing myself to stay calm. Last stop, the warehouse. Time to check on the brooms. I opened the door, and right on cue, a broom fell, hitting the light switch and flooding the room with light. That was it. I was done playing this game. If whatever it was wanted the lights on, I'd leave them off. I switched the light back off, glaring into the darkness, and stormed back toward the office. The moment I stepped inside, the creaking stopped. The strange feeling vanished, leaving me with only the sound of my own breathing. The rest of the night passed quietly, as if nothing had ever happened. I still don't know what caused it all. The strange noises, the eerie presence, the feeling of being followed. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe not. Either way, just another strange night on the job. I work in a nursing home, where my schedule rotates between day, evening, and night shifts. Transitioning between days and nights can be rough, but we all go through it together since everyone shares the same shifts. The facility houses about 100 residents across 3 floors, with a distinct L shape dividing the building into north and south wings. The nursing stations sit in the middle. Right now, the 3rd floor is undergoing construction, so only a few residents remain there. One wing is completely closed, with the walls being torn out, so only a single nurse is required on that floor during the night shift. I've worked nights on that floor many times and never encountered anything particularly strange. Sure, it's dark and creepy, but nothing out of the ordinary, until recently. For context, I've never believed in the paranormal. I've always had the mindset that I'd need to see it to believe it. That said, I do love true crime and horror, whether it's movies, stories, or documentaries, even paranormal ones. Over the years, some of my coworkers have shared stories about the 3rd floor being haunted. They talked about hearing strange knocks at night or seeing odd things. It was always entertaining to hear, and we'd laugh about it afterward. But a few weeks ago, something happened that's making me reconsider. It was just another night shift, and I was sitting in the nursing station, watching a movie and playing on my phone. I'd finished my rounds and had just responded to a call bell. However, I felt uneasy that night, like someone was watching me. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but I brushed it off. Then, something truly bizarre happened, something that's hard to explain. I was sitting there when suddenly a shadow seemed to drop from the ceiling and hover over me. By the time I realized what was happening, it vanished. My heart was pounding as I jumped out of my chair. It couldn't have been a shadow cast by something outside. The window behind me faced the forest, and there are no roads or streetlights, just trees for miles. After a few minutes, I calmed down and decided to check on the residents. Everything was normal. None of them were awake, except for the sweet old lady at the end of the hall, quietly watching TV. As I headed back to the nursing station, I thought I saw movement, shadows or feet, beneath the door to the closed-off wing under construction. Concerned that a resident might have wandered off, which happens from time to time, I opened the door to check, but no one was there. At this point, I was thoroughly freaked out but went back to my chair, trying to distract myself with TikTok videos. I sat with my back to the window, facing the door. After about an hour, I glanced at the clock. It was 3:03 a.m. I remember feeling a bit annoyed because my coworker had promised to come up at 2:50 so I could take a break and go outside for a smoke. I know it's unhealthy, but that night I really needed one. Suddenly I heard 3 knocks on the window behind me. I froze. Slowly I turned and looked out the window. Nothing. There was absolutely nothing out there. I was on the 3rd floor, with no stairway, tree, or ladder outside that window, nothing that could explain a person knocking. Panic set in, and I bolted down the hall, nearly crashing into my coworker as she stepped off the elevator. I immediately asked her if she had knocked on the window or heard anything. She hadn't. Seeing how shaken I was, she kindly offered to switch floors for the rest of the shift. I was more than relieved because on the second floor I wouldn't be alone, I'd be with another nurse. I went outside to my car, lit a few cigarettes, and tried to collect myself. When I talked to the nurse on the second floor, she wasn't surprised at all. She'd heard knocking up there too, and had experienced things she couldn't explain. A lot of people have passed away on the third floor, and after that night I'm starting to wonder if there's more to the stories. I've worked a few night shifts since then, and haven't had another experience like that. Maybe I was just exhausted, maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But I've never felt fear like I did that night. It's something I won't ever forget. Thank you for watching.